Hello, hello, hello. I am your host OCL, and welcome back to One Century Later. Today we'll be taking a look at all events from April 11th to April 17th, 1826. As with last week, all of my sources are in the description down below. Sunday, April 11th, 1826. Benito Mussolini arrived in Tripoli in the Italian colony of Libya, marking the first time an Italian leader visited an overseas Italian colony. Also on this day, the U.S. oil tanker Gulf of Venezuela exploded at 2:45 a.m. local time in the port of Arthur, Texas harbor. The explosion originated around the crew quarters, however the cause behind it is unknown. Gas fumes were discovered 30 minutes before the explosion occurred, so there is probably some connection. 29 crew members and dock workers were killed and 10 were injured, with 3 in critical condition. Miraculously, all men injured in the explosion, including the 3 in critical condition, survived. Monday, April 12th, 1926. The N-1 airship Norge left the RNAS Polham airship station in England, heading for Oslo, Norway at 11:45 a.m. local time. The airship would be used by explorer Roald Amundsen and his crew in an attempt to fly over the North Pole following his failed attempt the previous year. Also on this day, the U.S. Senate voted 45 to 41 to replace Iowa Senator Smith W. Brookhart with Daniel F. Steck. In 1924, Brookhart won the Senate election by a margin of 755 votes, and Steck filed an election challenge with the U.S. Senate Committee of Elections and Privileges. Steck served the remainder of the term until 1931, with Brookhart filing to run as a candidate for Iowa's other senator position in the election later in 1926. This was the first time the Senate overturned an election while the original senator was already serving out the term. And lastly on this day, the president of Haiti, Luis Borno, was unanimously elected to another term as president by the 21 members of the Conseil d'État, Council of State, Haiti's legislative body, whom Borno had appointed during his first term. Critics from opposing parties stated that this method of election perpetuated the control of the executives in office. Tuesday, April 13th, 1926. Pilot Lincoln Ellsworth and Arctic explorer Roald Amundsen left Oslo, Norway on their way to Spitsbergen in the Svalbard archipelago to prepare for their attempt to become the first people to fly over the North Pole. Wednesday, April 14th, 1926. Nothing of historical precedent happened on this day. Thursday, April 15th, 1926. Frederick MacDonald, an Australian politician who lost the November 14th re-election to the Australian House of Representatives to Thomas Leigh, disappeared while on his way to meet the Premier of New South Wales, Jack Lang, in an attempt to challenge the results of the 1925 election and have Leigh removed from office. Also on this day, the uninhabited Franz Josef Land archipelago in the Arctic Ocean was annexed by the Soviet Union using the same sector principle that Canada used the year before to claim ownership of all land and water all the way to the North Pole. The Soviet Union used the islands as scientific and military stations that are today part of the Russian Arctic National Park. Canadian Finance Minister James Robb reported the new budget to William King's government. The report stated there was a $55 million budget surplus, offering $25 million in tax cuts and reducing tariffs on automobiles and ammunition while increasing the tariffs on meats and certain fruits. And lastly on this day, Contract Air Mail Route 2, run by the Robertson Aircraft Corporation, opened in the United States, connecting St. Louis and Chicago, with stops in Springfield and Peoria, Illinois, using a modified de Havilland DH-4B aircraft numbered 109. Friday, April 16th, 1926. The army of Chinese warlord Zhang Julin, in their march to capture Berlin, reached the city of Tongzhou within striking distance of the city of Beijing. Residents of the eastern portion of Beijing fled, fearing artillery bombardments. In January, Zenith Radio Corporation began broadcasting on an open frequency. On April 16th, Chicago U.S. District Judge James H. Wilkerson ruled in Zenith's favor, stating that the U.S. government had no authority to regulate radio broadcasting, including radio frequency or power, stating that radio had advanced much since the Radio Act of 1912 and the outdated act no longer held effect. For the next 10 months, radio would be largely unregulated until the Radio Act of 1927 was passed in February. Saturday, April 17th, 1926. 20,000 members of the anti-communist Women's Guild of the Empire marched through London to Albert Hall to protest strikes and lockouts, believing they did more harm than good with respect to workers' interests. Communist sympathizers in the crowds booed and threw trash at the marching women, but were dispersed by the police. And lastly, on this day, Western Air Express began operations as a contract mail carrier servicing Contract Airmail Route 4 from Los Angeles, California to Salt Lake City, Utah, with a stop in Las Vegas, Nevada, using the Douglas M2 biplane. And that is all. See you next week for all events from Sunday, April 18th, 1926 to Saturday, April 24th, 1926. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.